today a very special guest, a man who I know quite well, John Sommer. And John, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. John is a veteran of World War II and the recipient of the Bronze Star Medal that he received for his role in combat in the European theater during World War II, and was with the 100th Division, the 397th Infantry Regiment, Company F. And he was so anxious to fight for his country. He was only 17 years old in 1943 when he decided it was time to do his part. Tell us a little bit about what happened then and what you went to when you first signed up as a 17-year-old, John.
Well, we had an opportunity to sign up at 17, which is a lower age than is permitted to go into full service. But as a result of that, we had an opportunity to go into Army Specialized Training Program, and the government therefore sent us to college at their cost, which was quite an advantage.
Very nice, yes, yeah. And that was because you were underage, but then you turned 18. I should mention to the folks that John also has written a book, and we're going to use his story as our conversation today because it tells about his time that he was in combat. But go ahead, then you turned 18. 18,
and then we were put into the service after 18 as a regular Army. And I went to the University of Kentucky in pre-engineering and stayed there for about 6 months until the program then folded and we were put in the Army.
And then you went to basic training?
Went into basic training in North Carolina.
And at Fort Benning?
No, that was, I can't remember. I think that was Fort Benning, yeah.
Yeah, Fort Benning.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for infantry basic training?
Correct.
And then after you got through basic and hung around, did a little bit of marching and walking and KP duty, I'm sure at some point in time, it was time to get ready to sail for France, and you went to New Jersey for that, right?
Well, after Fort Benning, then we went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
That's when you
and got a substantial amount of additional training. And there was more specific than what we got at Fort Benning.
Then you went on to New Jersey?
Correct.
When you sailed on a ship called the George Washington.
Correct.
And if I remember right from the book, you had about 7,000 people on that ship?
Correct.
Crowded?
Yep.
Tell me about the crowdedness. I love the way you expressed it to me. What were your sleeping conditions?
Well, they had, I guess it was a ceiling height of maybe 8 feet or something like that. And within that 8 feet, they had 4 bunks arranged horizontally, of course. And that was our sleeping arrangement.
And you had a little bit of room between your head and the bunk above you?
That's correct.
About how much?
Well, I don't think you could raise your knees completely when you were on your back, so it was cozy.
It was cozy. That was well put. That was well put. And I understand on the way over you had some weather issues.
Correct. Outside of New Jersey, we ran into a hurricane, which was really got our attention, and it was very severe. But after that and being sick during the hurricane due to the rough water, things leveled out a little bit.
Yeah, you probably had a lot of people. I was on a ship once where we were very near a hurricane, and I remember so many people that had a rough time. Of course, by that time, Dramamine had been invented for me. They didn't have Dramamine when you were in the Army, did they?
I don't know, but I don't ever remember taking it. But in that hurricane, the stern of the ship would go completely out of the water. The screw speed would increase. You'd hear it rev up, and then the whole thing would settle back down, actually flop down in the ocean. So it was an interesting time.
How was the chow on the ship?
Tolerable. what the heck?
That's a compliment.
Yeah, it was okay.
You can't fake me out. I was in the Army. I know what the chow
Yeah.
was in the Army, but at least there you shared it with many, and you had other things on your mind anyway,
Yeah.
didn't you?
When the ship would roll from side to side substantially, sometimes you'd end up with a tray next to you sliding in front of you,
Right.
and vice versa. So.
Yeah. I enjoyed how you described some of these things in the book that I read. This is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And I don't know if this has been printed for sale or anything, but I know a lot of people would enjoy your writing. Your writing is outstanding. November 5th, and you arrive in France. Well, actually, October 20th in France, and on November
Correct.
5th, you arrive where you're going to be relieving the 45th Division, and that would be your home in that general area, heading toward Germany for the rest of the war, which still had maybe like about 7 or 8 months to go. In the you pronounce the mountain range for me.
Vosges.
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 Okay, Vosges
Vosges
Mountains.
Mountains, right.
Yeah, and as you pointed out to me when we had a earlier meeting, it wasn't one mountain, it was a whole range. And
Correct.
you guys did a lot of up and down, right?
Correct.
And when you took over for the 45th Division, you guys were right there, right on the front lines, I guess, because
That's correct.
literally, I think the way you described it in the book is that one of their guys or two of their guys got out of the foxhole, and you and your partner got into the foxhole.
Correct.
And from that point on until the war ended in May of 1945, it was from one foxhole, one mountain range to the other. Now, tell me a little bit about, usually most foxholes, as I recall, there were some, but it really included usually a couple of people, right? Pretty much?
Usually
Sometimes
two.
more, yeah, but usually two. And you know, you expressed to me well when we met, and also I picked it out of the book as well, how important it was to have a buddy you could depend on and vice versa.
That's absolutely correct. And John Diamicis was that kind of a guy.
And we're going to talk about him. I
Yeah.
would like you to tell me some things about John as you talk about how important it was having a friend in the foxhole who you could count on.
Right. Well, he was, we first met in basic training down in in Georgia. And we stayed friends then through the rest of the war. And he was an extremely dependable and likable guy. And very, very stable. He wasn't flighty at all, which helped under the conditions.
Yeah, yeah. When you got in that foxhole, you get an awakening, don't you? What's on your mind? Well, I guess as you expressed it not too long ago, you realize all of a sudden you're in the big leagues, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
the play was over. This was the real thing.
Exactly.
And what happened, almost like on the first day, very near you, that really woke you up to let you know?
Well, a bullet hit a tree, and I realized how much noise a bullet makes when it hits something solid or semi-solid, whatever.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting experience.
You know, John and you both shared the foxhole most of the time. Not always, as you said. Once in a while you had to dive quick, and whoever dived in with you was there for that one.
Well, we were assigned sometimes, periodically. There would be arrangements made within the squad where we would buddy up with another guy. But John and I spent most of the time together.
And you had mentioned to me that it wasn't easy. It was the winter time, and you weren't that far from what one of the great battles of the whole Second World War in the European theater was going on. That's the Battle of the Bulge.
That's correct.
I mean, it was not that far away.
Well, that happened later.
Just a little bit later than when you got to France.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But it was the same winter.
It's the same
And
winter,
it was
but it
a
was
cold-
later in the season, but
Yeah.
extremely cold.
Yeah, extremely cold. And it's hard to believe, but when your feet get wet and in a foxhole, you're not getting any walking around. That's really dangerous, and you suffered some. Well, tell us about it.
Well, the Army had told us to try to protect our feet, and we did this by having an extra pair of socks, which we would button in the back of our field jacket, and to keep them dry. So when your socks get wet, you take those dry socks and put them on in an effort to avoid wet feet. But when you get water in the bottom of your foxhole, that's no longer possible. No. So after a while, I ended up with a trench foot, and my feet swelled up substantially, and I walked back then to a battalion aid station, and they immediately put me on a cot and told me to stay horizontal, which I did. And then after 3 days, they sent me back to the company.
You know, you had a lot of interesting experiences, and we can't cover them all that I read about in the book here. And as I said, you cover that so well. You have a real talent for writing and remembering. But one of the greatest stories that you told me in the whole book, as well as times that we've talked to each other, was what happened to you in Rimling, France.
Okay.
Tell me that story.
Well,
3 o'clock in the morning, right?
Yeah, it was 3 o'clock in the morning.
Pitch black dark.
We were on a, we were dug into a foxhole, and Germans, and we were on lower ground, and the Germans were on this hillside, and they attacked us at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we all went down this hillside into the town of Rimling. Bear in mind, it's 3 o'clock and it's dark. So we intermingled, and when we intermingled, it may sound ridiculous, but nobody shot at one another. It was, all of us were in very close proximity to one another, and you could have hit your own men as well as yourself. So we separated, and most of our platoon then went into the little town of Rimling, into the various houses, and stayed there.
Yeah, in a way, you almost had a unofficial temporary pause in fighting, because both sides, without talking about it, realized there was nothing good going to come from starting to shoot.
Correct.
Because you had no idea who you were going to hit, who you weren't going to hit.
You couldn't see.
You couldn't see.
And the only time you could see is when there was quite a bit of artillery going on, and that would light up the area.
Right.
But
right.
it was, you'd just see a flash, and that would be it.
So then, as time goes on, we get to May 1945, and an exciting day when it was announced that the fighting was over in the European theater. And I asked you a couple of times, do you remember how you found out? And it's interesting. It was such an exciting day, but sometimes you don't really know how you found out. All of a sudden, the war was over.
Right.
Everybody was throwing their helmets up in the air and hopefully not shooting their M1s.
Extremely thankful. Right.
But extremely thankful, yeah. But there was one bit of scuttlebutt, as I recall, and this came out last year when I talked to Howdy on the show, Howdy Hochul, that there was great concern about what was coming next, because there was still a big war going on over in the Pacific Theater.
Correct.
And the concern was that you guys maybe would have to go over there. What was the discussion, and what kind of training did you do that you never really got notified for sure it was going to happen, but everybody was sure that that's probably going to be next?
Sure enough that they wanted to give us a lot of additional training for eventually going to Japan, which was not a very pleasant thought.
No.
So we did train quite a bit, and fortunately, that never came to pass. The war over there ended, and we were extremely thankful.
Well, and then the war ended, and then you had to wait for your points to catch up so
Correct.
you could go home. And as I recall, you tell me you got to come home after doing some cleanup over there. What, over early 1946?
Well, no, we were actually an army of occupation.
Right,
so,
in Germany.
If you didn't have sufficient points, you stayed there building up points as you stayed
Right.
in the army of occupation. And then eventually got to go home.
Yeah, I remember a picture in your book. It appeared that some of the people were having to just make sure there were no unexploded bombs and things like that, that to make certain everybody was safe. And in the process, you also got an opportunity to get to know the people.
Yes.
And they were some pretty nice people, the down-to-earth people who had to suffer through the war. Because,
well, I had relatives there.
Yeah.
My grandfather wrote to prior to the war, and I went over to visit them.
And then it was home, college,
right,
chemical engineering,
right,
career in the rubber industry. Later on, you met Nancy.
Correct.
Started a family. You know, I want to tell you something, my friend. You're a friend and also a hero to me. I served for 2 years. You put in probably about the same amount of time as I did, but I didn't have anywhere near the excitement you had, and I'm glad. I praise the good Lord for that. I was very fortunate.
I could have used less excitement.
Yeah, I know. But you know, you handled it well.
Well,
you really did. Thank you so much for being on the program, John.
You're
It's
very
been my
welcome.
pleasure. Before we go, you got a couple of books there you wanted
this is,
to mention to me.
of course, it's hard to remember a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
But this is a book about the division, the story of the Century Division, 100th
Right.
Infantry. And then there are 3 regiments within the 100th Infantry Division. And this is a book about the 397th Regiment, which was part of that, the 100th Division. And then lastly,
I got that one there.
this is the book
Right.
that I wrote
That you wrote.
in 1985
Right.
to try to pull some of this stuff together while it was still reasonably fresh.
Right. And you did well.
Thank you.
You did well.
Thank you.
Thanks again for being on the program. Best of luck to you and Nancy. I'm glad we spent a lot of time together, and I look forward to the next time we get together.
Thank you for your comments. You're very kind. Okay.
Thank you.